Welcome to Josie to Lagos, an African podcast for Africa, from Africa. Today we are talking about Ethiopia. As you may have heard, there's a crisis in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is on the brink of civil war. So that's what this episode is going to try to break down so that you can understand everything that's going on. Now, Ethiopia is a very complicated country, a very large country, and a very important country. But by the end of this episode, you should be able to understand all of the dynamics, all of the relevant history, all of the interesting facts, and why everything is happening in the way that it's happening. On other platforms, you will get bits and pieces of that picture. But here we'll give you the full holistic picture so that you can fully follow everything that's going on. So, before we talk about the recent events which have led to what many fear will be a long-term civil war, let's backtrack and let's zoom out and actually start just by giving you interesting facts about Ethiopia. 10 interesting facts about Ethiopia. Number 1, Ethiopia was never colonized. It's one of the 2 African countries which shares that unique claim. After the scramble for Africa, European countries came into Africa, colonized Africa, extracted its resources, and basically made African countries their outposts. But that did not happen in Ethiopia. The Italians tried it twice, and both times they were defeated. They were defeated in 1895. They reinvaded Ethiopia, but then they were ultimately defeated in that World War I period. 2. Christianity in Ethiopia predates Christianity in Europe. Number 3. Coffee is originally from Ethiopia. Number 4. The African Union headquarters are in Addis Ababa, which is the capital of Ethiopia. Number 5. The Rastafarian religion is based on a man who was called Rastafari Makonnen. And what that means, if you break it down, Ras means leader. He got that label when he became a leader. And then Tafari was his name, and Makonnen was his father's name. You know, it's a similar naming style to the Jewish tradition. And he later became the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, which means the power of the Trinity. So his official title, you may have heard in some reggae songs if you listen to that, his official title in office was by the conquering lion of the tribe of Judah, His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie I, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Elect of God. This title reflects Ethiopian dynastic traditions which hold that all monarchs must trace their lineage to Menelik I, who was the offspring of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. So that's how the Rastafarian religion actually exists as part of the global religious community. Number 6, Ethiopia has the most UNESCO heritage sites in Africa. Number 7, Ethiopia is the source of the Blue Nile, which makes up 80% of the supply to the Nile River. Number 9, Ethiopia is the home of most of the oldest fossils which have been found on Earth. And this includes the oldest fossil of the species called Australopithecus afrensis. Let me try that again. Australopithecus afrensis. And this fossil is actually just called Lucy, as you can see, because the name is a bit tight. Lucy is considered to be the oldest direct ancestor of modern humans, many levels before Homo naledi and Homo sapien. So the oldest fossil of the oldest ancestor of the human species as it exists now is from Ethiopia. And then number 9, Ethiopia has built and is now filling a dam, which is called the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which will make them an energy exporter to the East African region. There's a whole nother episode that can be made just about that particular dam. Number 10, Ethiopia is the most populated landlocked country in Africa. Let's move to discuss the geography of Ethiopia, just to paint a picture for you so that you can understand. Ethiopia is on what they call the Horn of Africa. Ethiopia is Africa's second most populated sovereign state, with a population of over 110 million people. The first, of course, being Nigeria. There are over 80 ethnic tribes in Ethiopia, with 45 located in the southern part of Ethiopia, or in the southern region rather. Ethiopia is neighbored by 6 countries, namely Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, Eritrea, Djibouti, and Kenya. If you're thinking where it is on the map, it's actually above Kenya. So it's actually very high up on the African map. Now, the demographics of the country in terms of religion are that it's 63% Christian, it's 33% Muslim, and also there are smaller religions, including the Jewish religion and actually ethnicity, as well as African traditional religions. Now, that's a high level description. What really you need to start knowing and understanding is that Ethiopia has a federal government. Federal government is one which has regions within the country which are governing themselves, but obviously are still part of the country. If you think of federal systems, the United States of America is one where you've got governors running the state, but then the state is also part of the country and, has representatives at the national level. Nigeria is also a federal system. South Africa is a federal system to a degree. It doesn't have the same extent of autonomy, but in Africa there are actually 3 countries which are considered to be within the federal spectrum, and that is Nigeria, South Africa, and Ethiopia. The contrast to a federal system or a federal government system is a unitary government, and a unitary government is one which has centralized decision making and centralized legislative power for the whole country. But a federal government has those things decentralized to a certain extent. Ethiopia has the unique feature of being the only ethno-federal government in Africa. We'll discuss the significance of this later, but that's something that you want to underscore and underline because it does matter. There used to be 13 regions in Ethiopia, but now there are only 10 of these ethnic regions. Each region has relative administrative autonomy and extended legislative power. The regions are subdivided into zones, and the zones are subdivided into woredas. Some of these woredas, which are these small locations, they actually refused to be governed by the state that they're in, and they're given their own autonomy and given a special classification. They're called special woredas. The reason why this exists is because of the tribal mix in some of the regions. So if you remember, in the south, there are 45, in the southern region, there are 45 different tribes, and not all of those tribes view themselves as, being fit to be governed by the state. They want to be self-governing. And that's why you have these woredas. There's a delicate balance of that ethno-federal design. It's important to know that Article 39 of the Constitution allows for states to secede from the country. Secession is the action of withdrawing formally from the membership of a federation or body, especially a country. So there's a special provision in the Constitution of Ethiopia which allows for this. We'll explain why that's the case a little bit later. The capital of Ethiopia is Addis Ababa, which translates to New Flower. There are 2 cities in Ethiopia which have a special governance structure, and they are governed as chartered cities. Addis Ababa is one of them, and the other one is Dire Dawa. A chartered city basically bypasses the regional level of government and are governed under the federal constitution. This is a result of the ethnic contestations. Both of these cities ultimately were determined to be too strategic to be governed by a particular state. The governance structure is basically the following. It's a constitutional democracy. It has a bicameral legislature. And what this means is that it doesn't just have a parliament, it has a higher body. So if you think of the United States of America as an example, you have Congress, and then you have Senate, and then you've got the president. So what you have in Ethiopia is you've got the prime minister, then you've got the federal parliament, which is the House of Peoples. The House of Peoples representatives is the lower chamber of the Ethiopian Federal Parliamentary Assembly. It has 547 seats. Then you have the House of Federation. The House of Federation is the upper house of the Ethiopian Parliamentary Assembly, and it has 112 members. Each region, nationality, and people shall be represented in the House of Federation by at least one member. And this is to try to make sure that everybody is included. So that is a high level of the governance. And there have been violent clashes in Ethiopia. This is where this episode is going. And they've been so violent to the point that the UN and the African Union have called for calm. And some people are saying that the country is on the brink of a civil war. Others are saying the country is already in a civil war. To understand what could have led to this, you need to actually know the history of the region, and you need to know what the dominant ethnic groups are and what their political formations are. And once you understand that, and once you understand that there's a contestation of ideologies currently happening in Ethiopia, you'll begin to understand fully why things are the way they are. So I'll explain the dominant ethnic groups, and I'll explain the ideologies that are in conflict. Number one, you have three ethnic groups: the Oromo, the Amara, and the Tigrays, which basically dominate Ethiopian politics to a large extent and are the reason why we are where we are now. Now, the Oromo have 37 million people as part of the population, representing 34.5% of the population. The Amara are the second largest group with 19.8 million, representing 27% of the country's population. The Tigrays have a population of 6 million, representing 6.1% of the country's population. They are a smaller population group and actually are not necessarily, far different from some of the smaller tribes, but they've had a disproportionate influence on the modern politics of Ethiopia, and I'll explain that once we go over the history. The contesting ideologies in Ethiopia are the following. You have one group of people who believes in pan-Ethiopianism. Pan-Ethiopianism is about a unified national Ethiopian identity. And then you have ethno-nationalism. The ethno-nationalists don't believe in this unified national identity. They want to prioritize the tribal identities and the regional identities. And all of these things have come to a head. The dominant tribes and these ideologies that are contesting. So how did we get to where we are now? Let's go to the history of Ethiopia. The history of Ethiopia dates back thousands of years, and we have to start with Emperor Menelik II. Emperor Menelik II comes into power in 1889, and he is a critical figure to the expansion of the empire and the consolidation of the state. So 1889 is a good year to start considering the modern history. This history goes back thousands of years. As I said, Christianity arrived very early in Ethiopia. They have a history they can trace back to the Queen of Sheba and before that even. So let's just start with 1889 to get the modern history. So Addis Ababa becomes Ethiopia's capital in 1889. In 1895, Italy invades Ethiopia, but its forces were defeated in a battle which was occurred in a place called Adwa. And then Italy actually had to recognize Ethiopia's independence, but it retained control of Eritrea, and Ethiopia and Eritrea basically were one country at that point, and Eritrea was used as the access point to the ocean. So the reason why you have a lot of relationships between the Middle Easterns and the Jewish communities is just basically because the Red Sea is easily accessible from the Horn of Africa, so you can just cross over, and they used to do that. Italy invaded, failed, but it retained control over Eritrea. In 1913, Menelik II died and was succeeded by his grandson. His grandson, however, was deposed and succeeded by his daughter. The reason why this happened is because he was considered unreliable and he was closely associated with the Islam religion. And this made him unpopular with the majority Christian population of Ethiopia. So a man called Tafari became the rallying point of the Christian resistance, and he was instrumental in the deposition of the emperor's grandson, Lige Yasu. Now, when this happened, Menelik's daughter, Zewdat, then became the empress, and then she appointed Rastafari as the regent and the heir apparent to the throne. So that was the arrangement. In 1930, the empress died and was succeeded by Rastafari Makonnen, who then became Emperor Haile Selassie. And this is where you have this reign of the Emperor Haile Selassie, which happens from 1930 to 1974. During that reign, in 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia. Haile Selassie fled, and in 1941, they defeated the Italians, the British and Commonwealth troops, aided by the Ethiopian resistance, defeated the Italians and restored Haile Selassie to the throne. In 1952, the United Nations federated Eritrea with Ethiopia. In 1962, Haile Selassie annexed Eritrea, which then became an Ethiopian province. In 1963, the first conference of the Organization of African Unity was held in Addis Ababa, and basically it then became the headquarters of the Pan-African Project. In 1973, there was a massive famine and 200,000 people died in Wallo province as a result of the famine. Ethiopia has a very interesting geography because of the tectonic plates that all converge at the Horn of Africa. So one side of it is very lush and the other side of it is very dry, and that other side is prone to famine. So what then happened is in 1974, that famine then became a trigger point for the deposition of Haile Selassie. He was overthrown in a military coup, and then he died actually in custody the following year. The military coup of 1974 brought what was called the Derg, and the Derg was a military council. It ruled from 1974 to 1986. In 1977, Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam emerged as the leader of the Derg, and the Derg was a pro-Soviet military regime. It was a Marxist-Leninist military regime by its own identification. In 1977, Mengistu then started a purge of intellectuals, of critics, of media, of people who did not support the Derg and supported maybe the emperor. There was a period called the Red Terror from 1977 to 1979, and thousands of government opponents were killed in that particular period. I actually traveled to Ethiopia earlier this year before COVID-19 hit, and I saw this Red Museum, and I saw the extent of the brutality and the nature of the oppression. Basically, they would kill people and then torture others to try to get them to confess to being part of any resistance movement. It's also critical to know that in the 1977 to 1979 period, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front launched a war for regional autonomy. Now, Tigray is a region within Ethiopia, and it's in the north of Ethiopia. So in 1977 to 79, this region then became the headquarters for the resistance of the Derg, and it was getting support from other global actors, people opposed, of course, to Soviet Russia, to this worldview of a Marxist-Leninist view. As you recall, there was a Cold War at the time. So because it's close to Eritrea, close to Djibouti, they were able to get military supplies, and they were able to actually begin to create a buffer towards the brutal regime of Mengistu. Now, that regime lasted until 1987. And in 1987, Colonel Mengistu was elected as president under a new constitution. So the Derg ran the country from 74 to 86. In 87, early in 87, February, that's when Mengistu became the president. And so basically you still are having an oppressive rule, and there's a resistance that is building. And you have this coalition of actors, which was called the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. The Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front was made up of the Tigray region, the Amhara region, the Oromo region, and the Southern region movements. And these movements were called the following: the Amhara Democratic Movement, the Oromo Democratic Movement, and the Southern Ethiopian People's Democratic Movements. So they came together under this umbrella organization. These were all of the different movements that were fighting Mengistu, and they came together under this movement, which was then called the EPRDF. The EPRDF. And the leading entity in the EPRDF was the Tigray Liberation People's Front, the TPLF, Tigray's People's Liberation Front. These things are important to remember for a little bit later. It'll make sense, I promise you. In 1991, they actually captured Addis Ababa. Mengistu fled the country. He went to Zimbabwe. He was hosted by Robert Mugabe, and he still lives there peacefully, even though he committed all of those acts of terror. In 1993, Eritrea became an independent country once again following a referendum. There was a new constitution that was set up, and all of this process was being led by the TPLF. So Ethiopia then became this ethno-federal state where each region was designed to have autonomy, to have legislative autonomy, and also to retain the militias that it had accumulated as they were fighting Mengistu. Now, if you think about this, you begin to see how this would have caused problems, because now you've got all of these regions based on ethnic identities, and then you also have regions with their own militias, regions with their own governments, all under the oversight of the state. But because of the delicacy of the situation, this was considered to be something healthy. But if you think about it further, whenever you have these regional entities which are just purely based on one tribe, if the resources are not distributed in ways that make sense, if the power balance is not distributed in ways that make sense, you open up the door for tribalism. And some of the ethnic conflicts actually existed prior, because if you remember, before you had the Derg, you had this period of time where you had an emperor, Haile Selassie, ruling all of these people as a large country, and they're not all from the same tribe. So some people felt like they were never really included in the Ethiopian success story, but they were more subjects of the emperor. And then when they became independent, I guess you can call it independence, because I don't think that it's weird, because the country's never been colonized, so independence is the wrong word. But when you became free of the military regime and got into the democratic regime, there are tensions that predate the military regime, because before that you were under an emperor, and unless you were in the right tribal mix, you were not really benefiting as much from the empire. So after the constitution is established, the TPLF is the dominant driver of the coalition. They get the key government positions, including prime minister. Their region gets most of the resource allocations. They have most of the ministers in the council of ministers coming from their region. And then late in the 90s, 1998, 2000, there was a war with Eritrea. And what then happened is that in that war, it was the Tigray region, which was the one that fought Eritrea most. And basically they were battle hardened from having fought Mengistu's army. And a lot of military resources were then put in the Tigray region because of the threat that existed from Eritrea. So that's planes, that's tanks, that's artilleries. Several commands were set up, and they made up what was called the Northern Command. And the Northern Command was designed to deal with Eritrea. So basically you had a lot of people from Tigray in the army, and then you also had a lot of military resources in the north. Now what then happens is that you fast forward, and people begin to be uncomfortable and unhappy with the Tigray control of the state, right? Because they're seeing that the prime ministers are from Tigray. They're seeing that key ministries are from Tigray, defense, etc., etc. And then what you then see is in 2016, you start seeing anti-government protests. And the anti-government protests are coming from a region called Oromia, which is a region which is the most populous in terms of the different tribes. Remember, I said to you, the Oromo make up 35% of the population. So they start challenging this dynamic. They start challenging the resource allocation, and that begins to cause problems. In 2018, the protests were continuing. And then at that point, the Prime Minister, Desalegn, then resigned. This is 2018 February. After he resigns in April, Abiy Ahmed then, who is an ethnic Oromo, he then becomes the leader of the ruling party, which is this coalition of parties, but it's the ruling party, which is the EPRDF. To remind you, the EPRDF is the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. So he then becomes the leader of that party, and then he then gets elected prime minister. When he gets elected prime minister, he then, by parliament, not by the people, by parliament, he then launches a comprehensive program of political reform at home and diplomatic bridge building abroad. So what does he do? He releases thousands of political prisoners. Where did these political prisoners come from? They were arrested by the TPLF in the period of time where they were ruling, or where they were the ruling part of the coalition, because they were opposed to some of the things that they were doing. And then what does he do? He also then makes this peace deal with Eritrea, and they declare the war as being over, and Ethiopia agrees to evacuate disputed territory. And then later on in October of 2019, Abiy Ahmed is actually given the Nobel Peace Prize for having made peace with Eritrea, which is a war that many people are aware of and something that has been drastic in the Horn of Africa. And the Horn of Africa has Somalia, it has a lot of terror activities, and people were very worried that an unstable region would thus lead to more terror activity that could affect Kenya, that could affect many of the countries, including Ethiopia itself. So he gets this Nobel Peace Prize. But the question is, isn't it too early? This guy just came in. You're giving him a peace prize. There's been an issue with people being given these Nobel Peace Prizes early in their administration and then it turning out to be a bad idea. Suki of Myanmar actually is one person who was also given this Nobel Peace Prize, and then when she ascended into power, it was revealed that there was a lot of chaos and people were actually being killed in Myanmar under her supervision, not under her instruction, but she was the head of the state, and people were dying and there was no peace. So Abiy was given this award, but there was always a question mark on this award. I remember I was actually doing interviews and podcasts for Kaya FM at the time, and one of the questions that was raised was whether or not this was not a premature allocation of the award. So what then happens after Abiy Ahmed wins this Nobel Peace Prize is that he consolidates power, and he does this in December of 2019. How does he consolidate power? Remember, the whole time I've been telling you that the party has been built on, or the ruling party was built on, a coalition of four parties: the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the Amara Democratic Party, the Oromo Democratic Party, and the Southern Ethiopian People's Democratic Movement. These were the four entities, and as you can see, they were regional ethnic entities. So what Abiy says is that no, we don't need this regional identity. What we need is a common identity for the whole nation, and we need to dissolve these ethnic bases and make one party. So he then makes this Prosperity Party to be the successor to the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, the EPRDF. And this merger is part of his vision to have one Ethiopia, a pan-Ethiopia, united in diversity. Guess what happens? The TPLF, they leave. They say, we don't agree with this. We don't agree with this agenda. And basically, they have been feeling excluded from the power dynamics because remember, I mentioned to you that what happened is there was a shift from 2016 when the protests in Oromia started. And that shift led to the election of an Oromo to the prime minister position. So if you're from Tigray, you can then begin to see the balance of power is shifting away from you, right? So then the Tigray people, or the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF, they were unhappy from the jump and they left the coalition and then they went by themselves. Other people who were unhappy about this were the ethno-nationalists. So they are unhappy about the idea of a pan-Ethiopian identity, right? And ethno-nationalism is a form of nationalism where nationality and the nation's interests are defined in terms of ethnicity, with an emphasis on ethnocentric approaches to political issues related to national affirmation of a particular group. So the ethno-nationalists in and around Ethiopia opposed this. Critically, the ethno-nationalists also were in Oromia, the province or the region where Abiy Ahmed is from, and they started causing problems for him. So you had a resistance in Oromia, you had resistance in Tigray. There were supposed to be elections in 2020, but COVID-19 hit, and then what then happened is that the electoral board then said, we're not going to have elections in 2020, we're going to have them in 2021. The Tigray region said they didn't buy that. They said that, no, this is not true. This is happening because Abiy Ahmed wants to buy time. He wants to consolidate power. Remember, he's not elected by the people, and now he's created this new entity. And in fact, there are problems with his approach. Now, some of the parties in Oromia as well rejected the arguments made by Abiy Ahmed, and they also accused him of the same thing that the Tigrays were accusing him of. And in fact, there were many people who were arrested in the Oromo region as a result of, these attacks on Abiy Ahmed. And what then happened, just to give you some idea, is that in June of 2020, security forces in Addis Ababa arrested leaders of the Oromo Federalist Congress, and this was for violence which has been occurring in that particular province. They've basically arrested over 9,000 people, including government officials. They have been arresting members of the TPLF for charges of corruption, misconduct, all kinds of things. And the people of the TPLF, when the warrants were issued, they were in Tigray, and they didn't comply with the warrants. So none of them actually were arrested. So there are warrants for them, but they're not actually arrested. So things then escalate in September 2020. What happens? In September, Tigray holds its own elections, right? This is the northern region. They hold their own elections, and the TPLF wins 98% of the vote. And then this is actually what is now conceived by all to be an act of defiance and a precursor to all of the drama that we're seeing now. In fact, the Tigray government, after the election, said they would not extend the mandate of the federal parliament. On 5 October, they went on to say that they didn't recognize the legitimacy of the government. They didn't recognize the legitimacy of Abiy Ahmed. So now they've actually called for a confrontation. They've said, listen, we don't recognize you. And remember, the constitution allows secession of a region. So basically now they're setting it up. And if you recall, the TPLF was a critical region in making sure that they could fight Eritrea. So it basically has a militia of 250,000 people, their own regional army of 250,000 people. They have members of the Northern Command who are also in Tigray. And what has been reported by the TPLF is that a lot of these members of the Northern Command are actually with the people of Tigray and with the movement that the people of Tigray are on. And if you recall what we discussed earlier, there is significant artillery and other equipment in the north. So when Tigray does everything that they do, they are setting themselves up for a confrontation with the government of Ethiopia. In November, everything hits the fan, as they would say. On the 4th of November, Abiy Ahmed said that the TPLF had crossed the red line and they attacked a military base in Tigray, and then they forced him to respond. They actually said that Abiy was making up the story just to justify sending the military against it. But what then happened is that on the 4th of November, 10 airstrikes were executed, and fighting then happened in western parts of Tigray, especially close to these artillery bases which are in the Northern Command. The phone lines and the internet were cut, power supply was cut, and there have been casualties that have been reported. But it's not very clear what the extent of the casualties is because of the shutting down of internet. All of these things is unclear, and it's a difficult region to reach right now. On the 8th of November, Abiy Ahmed made his second move. He appointed new officials to key roles, because if you recall, the TPLF was really in control of relevant key ministries, key positions, key administrations. So some of these people were viewed as being loyal to the Tigrays, not necessarily to the Ethiopian movement and to Abiy Ahmed. So he then appointed new officials to key roles. Number 1, the army chief. Number 2, the deputy army chief. Number 3, the foreign minister. Number 4, the federal police commissioner. On Friday, the 14th of November, there was a major escalation. 2 airports in Ethiopia's Amhara state, and Amhara state neighbors Tigray. It's right beneath it. Tigray is in the far north, and Amhara is right below. And it's one of the regions with a large population which directs the agenda of the country. So what happened is the TPLF bombed 2 airports. The airport in Gondar was bombed, and another rocket aimed at the Bahir Day airport. That rocket missed the target, according to the government reports. Now, what the TPLF said was that the Tigray Defense Forces had conducted military strikes, and these military strikes were a retaliation for the airstrikes which were conducted by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's forces in various parts of the Tigray region. And this is a quote from the TPLF. As long as the attacks on the people of Tigray do not stop, the attacks will intensify. And this came from a spokesperson for the TPLF on a Facebook page of the Tigray State's Communications Office. Abiy has responded by saying that he's enforcing the rule of law. He's responded by saying that, they cannot be dictated to by a region that only represents 6% of the population. But the reality is, on the ground, the world is now facing the risk of a humanitarian crisis. There have been reports of a massacre. They remain unconfirmed as yet. There is the issue of internal displacement, where people begin to flee to other parts of the country as a result of conflict, and that often disrupts lives. It often leads to the loss of property, the loss of belongings, things that people have been accumulating over a lifetime. So there's that issue of a humanitarian element, as well as the disruption of learning for young kids who no longer can go to schools and have to stay in internal refugee camps or whatever the state comes up with. But definitely there's a humanitarian crisis that is brewing. In addition to that, there is the threat to African Union stability. If you recall, the AU headquarters are in Addis Ababa. That is not only the capital of Ethiopia, but the capital of the African Union. And while the conflict right now is very far from Addis Ababa, if it continues to be the case that Ethiopia is spiraling into a civil war, that could actually affect how business is conducted within the diplomatic structures of the African Union, and it is a serious concern that exists. What the African Union as well as the United Nations have called for is a ceasefire. They've called for dialogue between these two parties, and Abiy is really in a tricky situation, because what the people of Tigray have done, or rather the leadership, the TPLF, have done, is to challenge his fundamental authority as the head of state. By hosting that election, by refusing to recognize the administration, by actually raiding the artillery in the Northern Command bases, by getting soldiers to defect, it's a direct challenge to his leadership. But over and above that, his vision is being challenged. And it may be a noble vision, but we may have to all consider that it was too ambitious for Abiy to try to do two things. Number one, to push for a pan-Ethiopian agenda, and number two, to simultaneously try to consolidate his party base and to consolidate his power. I don't think that he could have had both in the same innings. He probably should have actually separated those things. And the other issue is there are big things that Ethiopia is currently undertaking. One of those things being the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And there's a lot of confrontation with Egypt. This is not the time for this kind of a conflict, because it destabilizes a lot in the region and in the country. Sooner or later, there will have to be an election. Now, they've delayed it because of COVID-19, and some of this really does seem as if Abiy was trying to consolidate his power, to remove rivals, to open up a pathway to him being elected with a strong mandate. Some of this clearly does indicate in that way. People who are supportive of Abiy will say that the Electoral Commission is one that is neutral, it's one that hasn't had a reputation of interfering with elections, and that may be the case, but some of these arrests to remove opposition members during the COVID-19 lockdown do smack of the same old African politics that we've seen. The question that then remains for us all to think about, and I'm curious to hear what you think, is Ethiopia ready for this Pan-African vision? Is Ethiopia going to give Abiy space for this, or has the ground shifted in such a way that Abiy is not going to do well in the elections, that Abiy actually is going to have a very short term of office because people in Oromia, people in Tigray, and even people in Amhara and some other regions that we didn't have time to discuss because of the complexity are going to look at all of this and think, hang on, this guy is not the guy, and we need to go for an identity that protects us first, as opposed to this pan-Ethiopian identity that doesn't necessarily lead to gains for us in particular. That's the question at the end of the day. I'm curious what you think. Let's have an engagement. This has been an episode of Josie to Lagos. Till the next one.